Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called film noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the podcast. Today we feature Sheldon Hall, who is one of my greatest buddies. We're into the fourth decade of our friendship, but who here gets to absolutely take a pop at me and tell me why I'm wrong about all things noir. But don't worry, no trigger warnings required. Sheldon is more than entitled. He is an emeritus fellow at Sheffield Hallam University, a former film journalist and lecturer. He is the author of Zulu with Some Guts Behind It, originally published in 2005 and then revised in 2014, and his latest opus, Armchair Cinema, a history of feature films on British television 1929 to 1981, which has just come out. He's also the co-author of Epics, Spectacles and Blockbusters, a Hollywood history from 2010, and co-editor of Widescreen Worldwide from 2010, and Film Critics and British Film Culture, New Shots in the Dark, which is due out in 2025. In addition, he has contributed chapters and articles on British and American film history to numerous books and journals, as well as providing interviews for many Blu-ray special editions of films, including, most recently, The Lives of a Bengal Lancer, Black Tuesday, which we worked on together, and Richard Lester's excellent film, Juggernaut. But now, time to listen to Shelley shoot me down. Sheldon, thanks so much for being on the podcast. It's lovely to have you.
You're very welcome.
So today we're here to talk about, well, I'm referring to it as noir scepticism, but before we get to that, can I ask you, as a way in, what would be your definition of film noir?
We'll talk about my skepticism towards the concept a bit later. If I'm thinking about what film noir means to me, when I need to recognise a film as film noir, it's a combination of generic elements derived largely from the hard-boiled literary tradition of the 1930s and 40s. It needs to be a visual style which is marked by chiaroscuro lighting, by a degree of expressionism and stylization, and obviously expressionistic use of shadow and so forth. And thirdly, a kind of crucially depressed or pessimistic or paranoid worldview, so that one has a sense of, if not hopelessness, because not all films noir end badly, though most do. Ending badly or almost ending badly does seem to be one of the kind of emotive criteria for me that I associate with film noir. It can't just be, as it so often now seems to be, a crime story in black and white.
No, because that's just
That's just a crime story in black and
black and white.
Yeah.
So with that in mind then, what would be the first film noir that you remember seeing that you would think of now as film noir?
I certainly wasn't aware of the concept of film noir at the time, and I would never have referred to them in this way. The moment that I can recall where I saw a significant number of the relevant films in close succession was Christmas 1975. BBC Two ran a season of Humphrey Bogart films called Christmas with Bogart. And then I saw The Maltese Falcon, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which is ambiguously noir, I think, Casablanca, Key Largo, and Beat the Devil, and a number of those other key Bogart films. Not The Big Sleep, which wasn't part of that season, and which later became what I think of as probably my favourite film noir, although I think it's only problematically and ambivalently a film noir. But I didn't see that at that particular time. I saw that much later. BBC Two later ran a Raymond Chandler season, where I did definitely saw it then. But those Bogart films were probably the first contact in close succession I had with a number of relevant films where I could clearly recognise something distinctive about them. I mean, there would certainly have been other films before that, but that's as a group of films, that was a key moment.
No, I respond to that idea of when, in the era when we were watching television and you could have curated television seasons,
absolutely,
which would kind of guide you at a time when pre-internet, when
there are only so many books that you're going to have access to through your library, let alone actually buying your own because you're too young to be able to pay these high prices. Certainly, the film for me, for instance, is Detour, which was shown on Italian television. This would have been about 1983, so I would have been, let's say 14. And they were introducing it as this remarkable, unusual cult movie that falls within this tradition of filmmaking, partly because, of course, what people know about Detour in terms of its being ultra low budget, shot on a very short schedule, and yet it turns out some of that may not be entirely accurate, so people have different opinions about that, but nonetheless it's this dark film, very pessimistic, very fatalistic, very deterministic, and absolutely ends badly for all the main characters, and has the style, has the voiceover. It's made by a European filmmaker in the expressionistic style, so absolutely fulfills all those criteria that you talked about. And that I'm not sure that in Italian they would refer to it as Il Film Noir. Probably no, I don't think so either. Not in 1983. Sure. I suspect that's not true. So with that in mind, I sent you a long list, a potential chronology of film noir, starting in 1927 and ending in 2025.
Yes.
Which I'm using as the kind of backbone for a book that I'm currently working on, which is an encyclopedia of film noir called the Film Noir Encyclopedia, which is hopefully due out at the end of 2025. Yes, it's hopefully a clear enough title. You got back to me and sort of said, I'm not sure all of the films on your list should be here. So I thought, I really want to have a conversation about this, and I want to have this conversation with you. And you've very kindly suggested that we structure this a little bit around certain genres and certain types of films that I have included in that list, but which I feel like probably after I talk to you, I'll be taking some out.
Well, one of the things I want to ask you about is how you compiled that list and why some of those titles are in there. Because some of them I was looking at thinking, what on earth is Noir about that? What is the Miracle of Morgan's Creek doing there?
Well, okay, let's start with the Miracle of Morgan's Creek. So, okay, if we're not all film fans of Preston Sturges, we should be. Wonderful filmmaker. But
I'll go along with you there.
One of the things I wanted to do in the book, the list is derived from, needless to say, a lot of other books devoted to film noir, but also some online resources. Now, the problem with online resources is they rarely come from one person. One list is begat from somebody else's list.
And of course, you don't know which persons they have come from.
That's right. So I've tried to be a bit cautious, but it is a long list. So the idea is it'll be reduced because the book has a maximum page length. It can't be more than 550 pages. So there's a limit. In my mind, one of the things I wanted to do was to try and expand a little bit on a very narrow definition of film noir so that I could include what I felt reflected my own feeling about film noir, which is less genre-based and more, shall we say, style movement based. We're going back here a little bit to the Paul Schrader 1972 article on Notes on Film Noir. So it's this idea that you can therefore apply some of the aesthetics of film noir to a Western or a gangster film or even a comedy. Now, granted, it's perfectly fair that I've probably picked some ones where you're going to look at that and it's going to pull you back. So I have to try and justify it.
Yes.
In the case of the one in question, because I put two. I put Miracle of Morgan's Creek and Hail the Conquering Hero. I suspect Hail the Conquering Hero is the closer one to noir just because it's got things like the bit when they break into a bank. So it's got a sort of a crime element. The cinematographer was John F. Seitz, who would go on to more or less create, shall we say, the mature film noir style with Double Indemnity, as most people would understand it. But he also did all kinds of other films as well, like Invaders from Mars. So it's not like he only shot one way. What I liked about it was that there's a kind of anti-establishment element. One of the ways that it appeals to viewers, it seems to me, is by trying to go against convention in a very clear way by specifically looking to buck the prevailing attitudes to morality and, the idea of the femme fatale or the homme fatale are partly, or by having films that are about the criminal underclass and making you indirectly root for them despite what the production code says you can't do, seems to provide a kind of specular version of the American dream. So it's this kind of capitalist critique.
Would it be possible then to talk about film noir as being one branch or strand of post-war movement primarily? And I know those Sturges films are towards the end of the war, but if we think of the main period of noir as beginning more or less around the same time as America's entry into the war and ending a couple of decades later, would it not be possible to talk about film noir as being one current of a broader ideological trend within Hollywood cinema of that period and maybe broader popular culture of that period, which is to do with questioning societal norms and, favouring anti-heroes and so forth, in a way anticipating some of the countercultural developments of the 1960s, which are much more radical in that respect?
Well, funnily enough, you fell into my trap. Not really. My introduction to the book, in essence, postulates a historical through line, which starts with, because the book's first film is released in 1927, and we'll talk about that one in a minute. In my view, it's the way that cinema changes with first the coming of sound to a certain degree, but really with the Wall Street crash in 1929, which changed society in a very radical and very real way. And the way that the coming of sound and what we now refer to as pre-code cinema meant that you had this people who wanted some kind of break from the grinding reality of the post-Wall Street crash era. On the other hand, they were anxious to find ways to get people into those cinemas, to bring them in when even 10 cents to go to the movies was potentially a largish sum. So one of the ways they did that was, with sound, the values of how you told a story changed a little bit, because the kind of advanced form of pantomime and visual representation gave way to perhaps a rather more pedestrian way of telling stories that was more imbued of a straightforward theatrical presentation, because of some of the limitations initially. True, or not always true, of course, but that feeling that you had to film in a kind of theatrical, conventional way because of the limitations of the early sound technology. But increasingly it made the films more real, more down to earth, more literally pedestrian. And therefore there was a tendency and an interest in making them a little bit racier, a little bit naughtier, making them allude to things that perhaps in the silent era it wasn't quite so necessary, because you had other reasons for bringing people into the movies. But now that you heard them speak, now that people had accents, people that didn't always match their looks, one of the ways of getting people in was therefore by having those elements come in. Now, in my view, you go from an established cinema to a shift to a new kind of cinema that runs for about 5 years, increasingly egging on certain things that are felt to be of particular interest to especially urban audiences, which of course is increasing. So it's the gangster story. And so we start with musicals because it's the sound era, we can hear, but that kind of tells off quite quickly. And so we get sort of gangster movies and violence as a weird combination sometimes. So Gold Diggers in 1933 tries to bung it all together. But then the production code kicks in. And kind of April 1934, you're sort of roughly not able to take these kind of liberties anymore. So that gets sublimated into what I think is screwball. So that critique, that kind of showing the other side of the American dream, becomes only possible through this very eccentric form of comedy, this very slightly bizarre mixture. So my feeling is that you get screwball as a way of having a go at the aristocracy, at the rich and the wealthy. So films like My Man Godfrey, It Happened One Night, those sorts of films. But that weirdly then folds into, once America enters the war, that sort of gets submerged and switches into noir, in that critique of the America that started.
Doesn't it also, sorry to interrupt, but doesn't it also, if we're sticking with comedy, doesn't it also transmute into the crazy comedies of the 1940s, which are much less based on what Stanley Cavell calls the comedy of remarriage and on class, which is the defining feature of the 30s films, but instead becomes focused on other aspects of character ensembles, for instance, in the Sturges films, or romantic relationships, which have a different kind of feeling. The Lady Eve. But also we're thinking about the other American comedies of that period, the wartime period. You're seeing the rise of star comedians like Bob Hope
but they're not screwball anymore.
No.
And my feeling is that screwball sort of ends really by the time America enters the war. If you're using it as a way to critique the class structure, shall we say, that seriousness, that is no longer possible at a time when there's supposed to be unity. Mm-hmm. So then it becomes about, okay, you can have comedy, you can have laughter, you can have a respite from the grimness of war and death and destruction. But where does that remaining sense of darkness, which was turned into a weird kind of comedy that was attacking even something like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, after all, it's about political chicanery, and yet it starts off as a kind of charming comedy, and then it's no longer a comedy anymore. We switch roughly around 1942, which is more or less when Sturges was more or less ending his great period with Paramount. Release dates go a little bit further, but he was actually making them then. So in other words, when America has really entered the war and noir begins to take a more commercial hold in terms of how to represent stories that want to grapple with some of these ideas, but instead you do it through what's now possible, which is to say you have less money to spend on sets, you have new equipment that's being developed for shooting documentary and news, therefore requiring less light, and that becomes part of the aesthetic argument that then matches with the expressionistic argument because of some of the filmmakers that have come in from Europe during all this period, because of course, the exodus of particularly Jewish filmmakers and left-wing filmmakers from Europe that's about to go to war with the Nazi machine. And therefore you then get noir as a kind of, it seems to me, a kind of continuation of that really continues until the end of the production code. It's kind of, the production code runs for roughly 35 years as something, 33 years where it's being really enforced, but obviously by the 50s it really starts to change. But that's what I'm going with in my intro. You don't have to agree, and obviously when I actually finish writing it, it'll be interesting to see where we end up, because this is only semi-formulated, as I'm sure you've noticed, Sheldon. But that's how
I write too.
So in my mind, that's sort of why something like, because even the Lady Eve, which you mentioned, after all, there is a big class element there. After all, she's a grifter, but he comes from hoity-toity, they're clearly a rich family, the Henry Fonda character, whereas Barbara Stanwyck is just this con woman. And then you get into a plot which is basically like a Vertigo plot, where great double bill. But I didn't include that because although it's about grifters, it doesn't look particularly noirish, and although it has a weird intensity to it, Does
Morgan's Creek look noirish?
I think visually, well, again, it probably back to Hail the Conquering Hero, which maybe gets closer, but I suppose it was this kind of, because of course it makes fun of what was going on in America at the time. So I thought they were interesting to include. I mean, some of the other films that you and I were going to talk about on this, two of them would be, one that I wanted to include, let's see if you talk me out of it, was Wonder Man, which is tremendously entertaining Danny Kaye comedy shot in Technicolor, in which not for the only time. He will then do it at least twice more. He plays twins in this case. There are doubles in other films, but in this one, they're actually twins. And one of them is very...
outgoing.
Thank you. Yes, very outgoing. And the other one is it's very introverted and
Yeah.
sort of bookish and intellectual. And the one that's very outgoing, who's a performer, witnesses a crime and gets knocked off. And is it Steve Cochran who plays? Is it Steve Cochran?
He's actually knocked off by Ellen Jenkins.
And Jenkins, sorry, yes.
But in the pay of Steve Cochran. Yes.
Yeah. And it's one of those situations where it's the second Danny Kaye film, so it's an opportunity for him to play two different characters and to play a kind of nebbish character, although maybe that's not quite right, but who gets almost possessed by his brother's own personality and persona, and he has to try and pretend to be his brother so that he can give evidence at the trial, even though, of course, he's actually been killed. And I like that because that's an idea that goes as late as, say, The Bedroom Window, the Steve Guttenberg film by Curtis Hanson, where one person has to pretend to gives evidence, but really it's somebody else who was the witness, but they're not prepared to come forward. So you want to do the right thing. So the other person has to do it for them. And then you get into trouble because, of course, you didn't really see it.
So is it the plot mechanism, therefore, that you see as defining the noir element?
In this, I thought in a couple of things. Partly it was the milieu. It's very much the 1940s, and there's gangsters, and it's the idea of the double is something that recurs in noir.
I did wonder if the doppelganger...
So it was that too.
But they're not really doppelgangers, though. They're just doubles. They're just visual doubles. They're not... They're not character
except
doubles.
that one is a vision.
Shadows, as it were.
You don't actually... You barely see them as twins. You know, he's a ghost. Yes. And so, in a way, it is a doppelganger in that sense. It's this vision.
Or Hopkirk deceased, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's not Roger Moore's alter ego in that sense, but it's not William Wilson, it's not Student of Prague, it's not those kinds of stories. At the same time, it seemed to me that mixture of it's got murder, it's got a false witness, it's got a gangster, the doppelganger. I thought there's an opportunity for talk about the way that the themes of noir are creeping in. Now, granted, this is in full noir era by this point. It's 44, 45. It's not proto-noir, it's not pre-noir. You're in the full noir. So there's that awareness of it as something that audiences are responding to.
Is it an awareness of noir, that it's at the same time as noir, while having very little in common with the visual style of noir, have no relationship to the hard-boiled literary tradition that informs noir through the key films of that era, and is essentially a showcase for a comedian and the kind of vaudeville type of skills and performative techniques that he brings to that, in which, like many another film involving crime as a thematic element, the crime is not really central to it, and the gangster milieu is really quite peripheral to the story. I mean, we have the intrusion of the gangster characters into a showbiz world.
But the murder of the brother is crucial, because otherwise there's no story.
Yes, true.
You don't get the ghost.
Absolutely, yes. But it's simply a motivator for the performance, isn't it? It provides an opportunity, yes, for Kaye to do his thing, and that I think overrides any noir element to it. I mean, there are many comedies that involve some element of crime. The comedy teams of the 30s and 40s, where they bring out criminal to book or something.
My favourite brunette has Alan Ladd in a cameo.
And indeed, which is much more of a proto noir spoof than Wonder Man is. I think you could probably make a case for that one. I mean, I looking through your list, I deliberately picked the films that I thought were particularly anomalous or odd, which is why I challenged you on this, and why we're talking these particular examples. So the people listening to this thinking, why on earth are they talking about Wonder Man when it's a podcast about film noir? This is why, precisely, because I'm not convinced that the elements there are sufficiently strong to make it a proto noir, even though it's, as you say, contemporary.
I suppose it's interesting because it shares some elements, but it uses them in a different way.
I will give you my own film of the same year as Wonder Man, which is a Technicolor comedy, which I think is a genuine noir, genuine noir parody, And I haven't forewarned you about this, so I'm going to spring this on you and see if you've seen it. And that is a Donald Duck cartoon called Donald's Crime.
Okay.
Have you seen this?
I don't know if I have or not.
Well, in the break, I'll show it to you.
Okay.
But Donald's Crime is as close a pastiche of noir as is possible in the field of animation. It's a 7-minute cartoon in which Donald Duck steals, I think it's Daisy Duck's, no, it's his nephews, Huey, Dewey and Louie's piggy bank, in order to go to a nightclub, I think it is. And there is a lengthy nightmarish sequence in which he is consumed by guilt and goes to a kind of noir night town. And there is a series of expressionistic situations and images full of dramatic lighting from street lamps and back alleys and all this kind of stylized representation of his extreme state of mind, which is exactly what you want from an expressionistic film. And it's a Disney cartoon. And that seems to me a film which is very conscious of the stylistic trends of the period and also the plot trends and thematic trends of the period, and is rendering it in parodic form, which is, I think, you can take that I think, as an indicator that something was happening around that time. There is some substance to film noir because it is being parodied so accurately by this little miniature. Whereas Wonder Man, it seems to me, is simply coincidentally contemporary. I don't think it draws to quite the same extent, either parodically or in terms of absorbing influences from other films of the same era. I think it's too much of a vaudeville musical comedy as a star vehicle. Than it's much more so than it is.
What about
a
something
crime film with
yeah?
songs.
I mean, what about something like, say, Arsenic and Old Lace?
Well, yes, I can see more easily how that would work in terms of your categorization. Of course, a film that was made 2 years before it was finally released because
of the war and the Broadway.
Yeah. Produced 42, released 44, and that has some film noir elements. It also has some gothic horror elements through the presence of obviously the Raymond Massey character, who was going to be played by Boris Karloff and was played by Karloff on the stage, and that too is drawing on some of those contemporary and past recent tropes of other films. But again, I think it's more. It's no more a film noir than something like The Boogeyman Will Get You, which is around the same time.
Okay.
Those other sorts of the crime comedies and horror comedies like The Cat and the Canary and The Ghost Breakers.
Sure.
I don't know that it has any more in common with film noir than it does with horror.
If we backtrack just a little bit to prototypes, the idea of
Yes.
prototypes, so therefore where you're leading to something but you're not quite there yet.
Mm-hmm.
I've included in my potential chronology a number of gangster films.
Mm-hmm.
And the very earliest title I plan to include in the book is Underworld, the Joseph von Sternberg film. You're not convinced. Now, I will say I understand why not, because it's a prototype for a gangster film. It's the first successful of those, the kind of the more or less the modern gangster story that in a form that will become recognizable in the 30s through the Warner Brothers films. What I find successful about it is particularly the second half of the film. You kind of ignore the kind of setup aspect of it. And one of the oddities about Joseph von Sternberg's films I find is that most films have 3 acts, and Sternberg seems to always just have 2. So you get this weird thing where you just switch from 1 to 2. So in this one, in the second half, once you've got the main character played by George Bancroft, and he's in jail, he's going to get out of jail, and he's going to get revenge, and you get all kinds of fun things like a description of how they're going to break him out of jail, and you think it's happening, and yet it turns out it's all theoretical. So you've seen it on the screen, but actually it's just how they'd like it's a fake out for the audience. As I say, this is a silent movie, and it was more or less the first proper success for von Sternberg. It was a big hit when it came out. I thought the second half of it, where it's partly because it looks forward to Scarface very clearly, it seems to me, particularly with the kind of siege thing at the end and so on, and the relationship with the woman who is in love with another man. If you like, now, okay, that's his sister in that one, but in this one, it's just his girlfriend. I thought that aspect of it, also visually, just because obviously the kind of style that von Sternberg was bringing to it, is one that leans into expressionism and therefore indirectly, obviously, is recognisable as has some of the same attitudes and stylistic quirks and that you associate with noir. But it also seemed to me that the kind of the darkness of the character, the emphasis on their psychology, and I suppose partly the sexual element to it, if you like, that too, is one that you associate with noir.
When you say the sexual element, do you mean the homosexual element?
A little bit of that, but also the strong as a motivating factor, which obviously is always very strong in von Sternberg's films anyway. Mm-hmm. And therefore, because of all of that, I thought, since we're talking about pre-noir, things that are prototypes, things that will, through their success in this case, and will therefore have an influence. Obviously, it's indirect because it influences gangster films that follow.
This is about to say that it is a prototype for the gangster film of the next 5 years or so, which culminates in Scarface. And I think those two films as bracketing movies are very interesting, that they do have a lot in common. The Scarface, it seems to me, is much closer to noir in its bleakness, in that everything that makes it a kind of a negative movie is given a positive spin in Underworld. So the gangster, the chief gangster, the Bancroft character, is redeemed in one sense or another. He develops a moral self-awareness that is denied to Tony Camonte. The rival couple, his girlfriend and the rival lover, survives and is more or less forgiven by the Bancroft figure. So that there is a positive development to elements which have the potential for tragedy and for bleakness, which are fully realised in Scarface, but which are not present in Underworld. I should also say that, by the way, seeing as we're giving credit to Sternberg, isn't Underworld also the product of Ben Hecht?
A little bit.
Jules Furthman?
Yes, true.
True. Both of whom are also key figures for Hawks, who made Scarface, and Furthman elements lead into other kinds of films as well in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, into films like Only Angels Have Wings and To Have and Have Not and Rio Bravo, the kind of romantic triangle and the disappointment in love of one of the key figures, or quasi-gay relationship between the two male heroes. Those kinds of things are very much Furthman as much as they are Sternberg.
Definitely. No, I absolutely, credit where credit is due, and the writers tend to never get enough credit because it all gets a bit murky. Yes. But when they made Thunderbolt a couple of years later, and it's Furthman again with Sternberg and George Bancroft, and they're clearly just trying to, and it wasn't as successful. It was a sound film this time, but they were trying to reclaim that success because that was such a real success and a surprise success. Whereas with Scarface, admittedly, a lot of people worked on it. It's based on a novel, so on and so forth. W.R. Burnett, I think, worked on it for a bit. But Hecht is one of those people who clearly was influential. So I think that's
George
fair.
K. Arthur.
George K. Arthur.
Is the name.
I'm glad you remembered, because there's no way I was going to remember.
You can put that in afterwards. George K. Arthur.
One of the films that I really wanted to include, which you sort of nixed, is 20,000 Years in Sing Sing.
No, I didn't nix it in that I was planning. That was one of the films I had in mind to watch, which I didn't get around to seeing. I have seen it some time ago. The film the same year that I did watch in anticipation of this discussion was 2 Seconds, which I had not seen before, and which has never, as far as I can tell, been shown on terrestrial television. It's been on TNT, and I watched a recording of it from that. So this is 1932, directed by Mervyn LeRoy, starring Edward G. Robinson, and is very much a kind of road to ruin, in which an ordinary guy, construction worker, meets a girl at a dance hall, a taxi dancer, is warned by his best friend that she's a gold digger, but ignores the advice, is tricked into marrying her, and goes downhill from there, ends up accidentally killing his best friend and killing the wife. That, it seems to me, does have a great deal of proto-noir elements to it, in that everything that could go wrong does go wrong. And it has this kind of spiralling series of traps and catastrophes that befall the central character. It's all done in flashback, which is very unusual for 1932. And the title derives from the fact that the opening sequence of the film is seen from the point of view of the press people at an execution. So the press pit, as it were. There's a discussion which introduces our central character before he appears, and Robinson is being led to the electric chair. And the title derives from the fact that all of this narrative that we're about to see goes through his head in the last 2 seconds of his life, between the pulling of the switch and his expiration in the electric chair.
Which is very noirish, yes.
Yes, it has a really quite extraordinary climactic courtroom sequence where the Robinson berates the judge and makes his case in a very lengthy and tortured speech, in which he says, "Why do I have to die now? I deserve to die 2 months ago, 3 months ago, but why now?" And there's this wonderful kind of paranoid element to it, in that you don't necessarily think that the advice that he's been given by his best friend is the right advice, but yes, it turns out to be. She is as bad as she's been painted, and it becomes increasingly nightmarish, this situation that he's involved in. And of course, we all already know that he's going to end very badly. Yes, he's going to face the ultimate punishment for it. So that, it seems to me, has a lot of the elements in anticipatory form of noir, while also being very much of its period as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously
the little guy who gets into a bad situation and all goes downhill from there. That which feeds into noir in the 40s too.
Before we sort of jump genres, there's one film that you seem to question a bit, which surprised me a little bit, which was the 1931 version of The Maltese Falcon with Ricardo Cortez, which I'm a huge fan of. First of all, I think it's a very good film. And again, it's derived from the hardboiled literature of the time.
Yes. Yeah.
Its style obviously is in that kind of breezy, tabloidy, often very humorous or sarcastic mode that we associate with the Daryl Zanuck era at Warner Brothers. And yet, at the same time, it has a hardness to it, compared even with the Bogart version from 1941, particularly in its ending, which it's not even in the book. That scene when he basically goes to death row. It's a less romanticized ending because he's a less romantic figure, although that scene at the end, I think, it changes how we see him. And that seems to me, in that definition of proto-noir, if you like, it's clearly, you're moving, it seems to me a bit of a stepping stone from, at a time when the private detective on screen was very, very rarely the protagonist. In fact, it almost really hadn't happened yet. So this is one of the very first films where it isn't just a seedy side character, but actually it's the profession of the lead character, who is presented nonetheless in quite a seedy fashion. He's a lounge lizard.
I was about to use exactly that phrase.
Yeah,
yes,
he's got this permanent grin on his face. He's got this horrible affectation. He goes around going, "Yes, sir," which is thoroughly tendentious, and
his lip smacking lechery. Any woman who enters the scene, enters his office, is potential prey.
And because it's a pre-code film,
yes, and he gets away with it.
He gets away with it.
Well, I mean, for me, the crucial difference between those two versions of the Maltese Falcon is precisely the presentation of and performance of. Crucially, the actor chosen to play Sam Spade. And we should say Ricardo Cortez plays Spade in the 1931 version, out of course Bogart in the 41 version. Their performance styles, I think, are what makes the difference between a hardball detective story and a film noir. And that's why I would accept the description of Huston's film as noir, precisely because of the increased inwardness of the central character. You have a strong sense of the moral decisions weighing on Spade in the Bogart performance, that he has some genuine feelings for Miss Wonderly, and who gets to him in a way that her equivalent character in the 31 version never does. And there's a sense, therefore, that he's almost defying his desires and his, not his better instincts, he's defying his baser instincts, and he's being more noble, but he's also in a sense, grappling with that kind of inner turmoil in order to do justice in that
a little bit,
sequence.
yes, and I agree with that. Except that, though, I'll come back to this because I think it's perfectly right. You can't say, look, you can't just have one scene at the end define it for you, and the preceding 78 minutes don't count. I think that's fair. Sam Spade in the original, let's call it the original version, the
Yes.
first adaptation of 3 that Warner Brothers did.
Yes. Also known as Dangerous Female.
Dangerous
it's worth
Female,
saying, yes.
when it went on to
When it went-
TV,
yes,
right?
yeah.
It is more plausible in a kind of horrible way, in the sense that he is the seedy private detective before he becomes
Yeah.
more chivalric, more mock
Yeah.
heroic
Yeah.
in the culture. And it's a more realistic, probably, reading of that type of character. I do think that the toughness of the ending, which shows, finally penetrates the exterior. The idea that you see it as a mask, as an exterior, that he has this, like you say, he doesn't really let people get to know him, and us too, of course, which is from the novel, which is why I know that some people don't really like it as a novel, because you do not have access to what's going on inside Sam Spade's head. So on the one hand, it means that you never know what he's going to do, which is exciting. But on the other hand, you don't know what he's really like as a person. You don't know if he's really saying what he means or not. The important scene in the Bogart movie is the final dialogue scene with
Yes.
Miss Wonderly, where he sort of says, look, you probably won't understand, but I'm going to try and tell you anyway. And, sorry, go ahead.
Can I ask you something? You know the literature better than I do. Would you say that the presentation of Spade in the 41 version is more Chandler-esque than Hammett-esque?
Yes, in the sense that Chandler's lead character, his Philip Marlowe, is more romanticized than Sam Spade is. Sam Spade only appears in one novel and a few short stories, so he's not a series character otherwise, beyond that. But Hammett's characters are much tougher. You can see the reason why Hemingway liked him. Hemingway would have considered Chandler a bit of a sentimentalist by comparison. But nonetheless, by the time you get to 1941, so you have the advantages of being pre-code, which also means that you're pushing certain things just because you think you're sexing up the narrative. By 1941, there are certain options that are no longer available to you. You can't even release the 1931 version without cuts, and that last scene would almost certainly have been cut. So that's almost one of the reasons why they probably remade it. Was actually that it was that they couldn't re-release it, so they might as well remake it a little bit.
And of course, they'd remade it already, and we should probably acknowledge at this point
The
Sacred
Screwball,
Metal Lady,
yes.
which is exactly the screwball version of
which
the
again,
same material.
back to my argument, you see.
Okay.
Starring Warren William, who
And Betty
was,
Davis.
and Warren William was kind of an actor who at Warner Brothers was kind of in the William Powell mode,
Yes.
and who inherited William
He
Powell
played
roles.
Philo Vance?
He played Philo
Yes,
Vance
yeah.
when Powell went to MGM, having been stolen from Paramount to Warner Brothers. Then they got a deal. He went to do The Thin Man, the other Hammett character, but which is deliberately comedic and lighter.
Yeah.
Warren William comes in and does that, and does Philo Vance, and then also does Perry Mason, and is the first person to play Perry Mason on screen, who in fact then is replaced by Ricardo Cortez for one film as Perry Mason. A very unlikely bit of casting as Perry Mason, it's got to be said. But I think it's fair to say that therefore the Bogart character fundamentally is slightly less hard and more romanticized. So therefore, yes, more Chandler-esque I think is fair. But it's in keeping partly with the censorship rules of the time as well, because Huston did pretty much just do the book. Most of the dialogue from the book, the entire structure is taken straight from the book. They just take things out of it. Virtually nothing, except for that shot, that famous shot, which breaks the style of the film, where you see Archer being shot, being murdered. This is Spade's partner. Otherwise, which also is not in the book that way, you see it straight through. One of the interesting things about the 1931 version actually is that you see Spade speak to a Chinese man who's a witness, and because Spade, it turns out, speaks Mandarin, he finds out from the witness who killed his partner. He knows it right from then. He does the entire film and he knows who's responsible. That's not true in the Bogart version. He eventually divines it, and has to wrestle with the moral ambiguity of it. Spade isn't planning to be worried about it one bit in the 1931 version until you get right to the end, when he realised he's done what he was going to do. And in fact, which is not...
So this is the tag in the
tag,
in the
you know, he gets sort of his job back at the district attorney's office or something, you know, so he's done himself some good by doing this, but then he feels bad about it because he is conflicted. And that is presented very clearly in that sense. It's not ambiguous at all. He's crushed by it. He pretends. He then puts his face back. Puts his face back on and smiles his way out. But you get the shots of him looking completely crestfallen, completely broken by that. So, but I take your point.
You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.